Hello, Faithful Politics listeners. This is your faithful host, Josh Bertram, and we have with us, of course, our ever political host, Will, who just is fresh back on his gubernatorial campaign with the slogan "Make Virginia OK Again."
Yes.
Will, how's that going?
Oh, it's going great. Yeah. Apparently, there's some issues about trying to run for governor on a non-election year. So once we get that figured out, I'm sure we'll be right back on the campaign trail again.
Oh, right. Well, maybe you could just go for the House this time. But we have as our guest today, Gene Zubovich. Gene is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Buffalo. He has his PhD from the University of California in Berkeley, as well as his MA and BA from the same institution. He has his first book project called Before the Religious Right, Liberal Protestants, Human Rights, and the Polarization of the United States. He just wrote that, and we're going to be talking with him about that today. Thanks so much for coming on. Jeannie's also written many articles, several articles in places as like the Washington Post and the Religion and Politics and several more. So thank you so much for coming on, Gene. Anything you want me to add? Like, do you swim with sharks, or have you ever anything else?
That's plenty. No, I played the didgeridoo. It's a fun fact about me.
Do you really?
Yeah, it was like
we should just talk about that.
When I was leaving California, I was, living in Berkeley at the time, and I, was moving to Missouri, and I was like, "What's the most Berkeley thing I could learn how to do?" And that's what came to mind.
The didgeridoo.
So you know how to do like the circular breathing and everything?
Not well, but I need more practice. No, I actually didn't stick with that super long, but I did take a couple of lessons. Lots of fun. Highly recommend it. It's always fun to learn an instrument. But thanks so much for having me here. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, same here. So, help our audience get to know you a little bit. Like, just maybe tell a little bit about yourself and what got you interested in writing about religion in America.
Ask myself that every morning. No, it's such a fraught topic. Yeah, no, it's kind of like an unlikely project. I never expected to be, a historian of religion, let alone, Christianity and liberal Protestantism, because I didn't grow up in, that community. It's totally foreign to me. I was born in what was then part of the Soviet Union in present-day Belarus, and my family and I came to the United States in the late 80s as Jewish refugees. And, I think through that experience, I've always had kind of like an interest in an appreciation for, international humanitarian organizations, including religious ones like the Hebrew International Aid Society, which is the one that helped get my family over to the States. I had an appreciation for the politics of religious liberty because, the legislation that was crafted that helped get my family over to this country was, written in that kind of like religious liberty moment of the late 1970s. I'm happy to talk more about that really complicated, interesting history. So I guess in a sense, biographically, I was always interested in this stuff, but the project on liberal Protestantism was really kind of came out of nowhere. I was surprised. I didn't expect to be writing this book.
That is so interesting. So how I have this quick one, and then I have one follow up before Will comes in. But how did you end up writing it? Like, so what? Obviously, it's got some connection to your past, but what actually was the catalyst that made you write this book for this time?
Yeah, so, long before I decided to choose this topic, I became, I had already chosen to become a historian. I was in graduate school, and I was in California at the time, and I was looking for, I was interested in kind of, like race relations and, in California in the mid-20th century. And I stumbled upon a little book by a Congregationalist minister that nobody has really any reason to have heard of. It's a guy named Buell Gallagher, who kind of was a household name for a minute in the late 1960s. He was the president of the University of New York, when the student protests took place and a couple of buildings got burned down. I think that was in '89, so that was kind of his moment of fame, but he had a kind of a long religious career, a really important one. And way back in 1946, he wrote this book that was probably like the most thoughtful critique of American racism and really global racism written by any white person in the United States prior to the 1960s. And, I had grown up, in the wake of the religious right in the United States in the 1990s, where, religion in public was kind of synonymous with conservatism. And so, looking back to this book and this person, it was really surprising, right, to see, kind of public political religion wielded in this really interesting way that I didn't really have any connection to personally, and I didn't experience my everyday life because, from what I understood, right, Christianity was this kind of monolithic conservative thing. And so, I decided to dig deeper into his background. And, through his biography, I kind of traced the links and it opened up this kind of much broader world of, the religious left, which wasn't just, a kind of nominal, small thing kind of hidden away in a corner, right? From the 1920s to the 1960s, this was by far the most powerful, popular, well-politically connected, and influential group in the United States. And so it's really not through a kind of personal connection or because I'm, a member of this group. It was really, I did this project because I recognized its importance to American history, even world history, right? If you want to understand how we ended up where we are today, right? You have to go back before the religious right. You have to understand this earlier history of American religious liberalism.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I'm going to push in and ask you to dig down on something that you mentioned there, because, of course, all of us have heard of the religious right, but the religious left, I thought that was an oxymoron. I didn't think that existed. I thought that was a contradiction in terms, when I grew up. So talk to us. What is the religious left? Why is it important? What do they accomplish?
So the religious left, I mean, it's a broad group and it looks different in different moments in time. So my little sliver of it is really the Protestant left. These are, for a long period of time in American history, the United States was not thought of as a Christian nation or a Judeo-Christian nation. It was, lots of folks believed that it was a Protestant nation. And so there was, even though we didn't have a kind of established church in the United States, like they do, say, in England, right, or in Germany, we did have a kind of, what one historian calls a moral establishment, these, mainline Protestant denominations, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, and so on and so forth, who really felt like this was kind of their nation, and they were really culturally dominant up through the 1960s, going into the 1970s. And so that's the kind of, that's the sort of religious background in the United States, right? There was this kind of culturally predominant group, and within this group, many of its leaders, subscribe to what we think of as, kind of left or politically liberal ideas. So between the 20s and the 60s, they were at the forefront of trying to diminish economic inequality. They were really interested in, at least by the 1940s, trying to get rid of Jim Crow and segregation in the American South. They were trying to find ways to make, war less frequent and to, find alternatives to the Cold War. And so they're really politically important. It's, where this all comes from. Part of it came from liberal theology. So when I call Protestants liberal, sometimes I mean they're theologically liberal, which means that they read the Bible kind of historically and critically, in the context of its own time, almost like kind of a living document that requires interpretation and, deep understanding. They were also, politically liberal, or became that in the sense that Franklin Roosevelt used the word liberal, the president, through the 30s into the 1940s, who by liberal he meant, somebody believes that the government has the responsibility to take care of American citizens, especially economically. And by liberal, he also meant, a liberal would be somebody who was willing to kind of engage internationally, to take part in international institutions to get America kind of involved in broader global politics. So that's kind of how I use those terms.
So you wrote an article in the Washington Post some time ago called "Christian Nationalism is Surging. It Wasn't Inevitable," and I'd love for you to unpack that. But before you unpack it, I'd love for you to just to kind of define, like we hear this term Christian nationalism. If you could just define what that term means, and if the term has morphed or evolved over the years, like is our modern day Christian nationalism definition the same as it was 30 years ago?
Yeah, it's a really fantastic question. It's a very fraught and divisive term among academics. My own take is that, we used to call this kind of religious populism. In a couple of years, we'll call it something else. So, what most people, I think, mean by religious nationalism is just, right-wing religious extremism, right? Like, that's what we're worried about. We're worried that a lot of folks who are, come out of a kind of, evangelical or Catholic culture are infusing that culture with, racist ideas, homophobic ideas, are abandoning democracy, and, people who are talking about Christian nationalism are worried about it. So I think that's kind of like where that comes from. In the most technical sense, the way that some sociologists use it, Christian nationalism, means that people believe somebody who's a Christian nationalist is somebody who believes that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and essentially, it was founded by and for Christians, and a kind of the country belongs to them. And what these sociologists have found is that people who believe that, right, also believe all these other things we really don't like, right? People who believe that also believe that, African Americans aren't entitled to equality, or, Jews control the economy, or, Joe Biden stole the election, or what have you, right? So the people who use that in a kind of more technical sense, right, are talking about this belief that, this kind of misconception that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and that people who hold that belief, right, are more likely to also believe these other things. But to your other point, this sense that this kind of right-wing religious populism wasn't inevitable, the kind of main point of that article was that, for much of American history, this idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation goes all the way back to the founding moment, right? Lots of people believe that all over time, right? Like, not everybody was like marching up the Capitol, even though they believed that. And part of the reason was that, the existence of this religious left, these, liberal Protestants who were powerful, politically connected, acted as a kind of counterweight in American politics, right? They could speak in very credible ways to a religious populace in the United States, to counteract, right, at certain historical moments, these, the conflation of Christianity and, American nationalism. And so they're really good at kind of balancing out our politics. And it's only when the religious left got into trouble, started experiencing problems, and started experiencing a kind of demographic decline, starting in the 1970s, it was only then that, the thing we today call Christian nationalism was able to kind of rise. By the 1980s, you saw the rise of the right, and Christian right. The 90s gave us the culture wars, and today that's kind of morphed into this thing, right, we're calling Christian nationalism. But for much of the 20th century, at least, the Christian left, and the Protestant left in particular, was really good at tamping down Christian nationalism and organizing and advocating against it.
So it's almost like the yin and the yang. You get rid of the yang, and then the yin, it is yin and yang. Then the yang takes it all over. The yang, the yan. I sound like I'm from New Jersey or something.
Swing and a miss, Josh. Swing and a miss.
Yes, dude, totally swung. But no, that's. I've always thought about because of course I was born in '85. So besides making me that young-ish, I don't look young, and I'm not really that young, but I was born in '85. So I grew up in the midst of, if you're a Christian and you're political, you were on the right? But obviously that was a historical, specifically American historical development. What can you help us gain some context by maybe tracing liberal Protestantism, which you gave somewhat of a definition, we're talking about kind of more liberal theologically, but could you help us understand, what happened maybe starting in the 19th century or something like that, moving on to the big picture, so we can get a big picture of it started, it rose, it declined, and here we are today where it's almost like the Democratic Party, there aren't the association with Christianity is almost like they want to avoid it. Maybe not that's a blanket statement for sure, but kind of how did that get to this place where we are now?
So the general pattern in the United States from the colonial period through the Revolution, really into the late 20th century, has been one of a country that's become more religious over time. When the United States was founded in this kind of historical moment.
So I've never heard that before.
So this is the opposite, right, of what we usually think. And it's not to say that folks weren't, religious in certain kinds of ways. It's actually much more complicated than that. But in terms of most markers of religiosity that we use, like church attendance, in 1776, maybe 17% of Americans went to church. And that rose over time through the 19th century, reaching a peak, 1950s, 1960s, when over half of Americans went to church. So Christianity, began in this country. Organized Christianity was, in a relatively weak position, but got stronger over time, right? So by the time you get to the late 19th century, it's sort of everywhere in the culture and the politics, it's really widespread. And by the 19th century, what some thinkers in the United States, in England, in Germany, other places, some theologians start arguing, right, is that essentially the way that American Christianity had developed over that period of time, the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, was really based around an agrarian society. And all of a sudden, Protestant ministers, folks like Walter Rauschenbusch and, G. Bromley Oxnam, found themselves in places like, Hell's Kitchen in New York, or the railroad yards in Los Angeles. And they were dealing with, multi-ethnic, multiracial populations, lots of immigrants, folks who were struggling, physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually. And what these ministers started arguing is that, the idea of kind of an individual notion of salvation is really just rooted in America's agrarian past. The idea that you can kind of lift yourself up by the bootstraps, that if you want to be a good Christian, just kind of focus on your own internal life and, reform yourself. If you're suffering, it must be because you made some bad choices. That was fine for farmers in the 1840s, but, now you've got cities, you have crime. And so they started paying attention to, what they called, social sin or collective sin. Today we'd call that, structural sin. Thinking about the ways in which the urban environment and, the ups and downs of the economy and all this stuff shape people's lives. And so they started saying things like, in order to create good Christians, we can't just minister to people's souls. We need to minister to their bodies. In order to understand sin and salvation, we can't focus just on the individual. We need to look at the whole society. And a lot of these folks became activists. They called themselves, this was kind of the heyday of the social gospel movement, but it went by many names and many norms. Christians in the late 19th, especially going into the early 20th century, started, setting up, schools, hospitals, what are called institutional churches that do more than just preach, right? Like they try to take care of you, like every day of the week. They started, creating social safety nets when the government wasn't doing that, and they started advocating for the government to kind of do more to help these folks. And so out of that movement came a bunch of different stuff. In the 1920s, 1930s, a lot of folks became, Christian socialists. That was sort of one movement that came out of the social gospel movement. Other folks, got involved in the pacifist movement, anti-racist movement, international work. It went in a bunch of different directions, but all these things kind of lead back to this idea that, Christianity is more than just about saving somebody's soul, right? You have to kind of minister to the whole person, and to understand the whole person, you have to kind of understand the society and think about the structures of society in which that person is living. If you want to kind of tackle their, both like economic and social and spiritual problems.
Now, I know you're writing a book on like global history of U.S. culture wars, and I'd love to get your take on, where we at today regarding kind of U.S. culture wars, and if it's applicable, its connection with like identity politics. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So one thing I should say first is that, my first book, Before the Religious Right, is also really thinking about this globally. I started off on that, writing that book, thinking it was going to be kind of a straight traditional political history of liberal Protestants from the 1920s to the 1960s, and it was going to focus on, racism, the economy, and American foreign relations. But what I found out was that, a lot of the things that people were saying or doing really had to do with a kind of broader global context. For me, the thing that really stood out was the importance of the ecumenical movement, which started in the early 20th century. And all these liberal Protestants started trying to, thought of it as kind of a theological injunction to unite Christians from across the world. So they started building these international organizations, the International Missionary Council, the World Council of Churches, and through these organizations, they were meeting, with Christians from, first predominantly from Europe, but also from China and India, right, from different countries in Africa, Latin America. And so over time, it kind of became a global movement. And a lot of the ideas that they came to hold, these kind of American liberal Protestants, right, came out of their interactions with, Chinese or Czech or Ugandan Christians. And so even way back, right, in the heyday of American liberalism in the mid-20th century, international engagement, international ecumenical engagement was really important to not only American Christianity, but also American politics. And so I think the same thing is true today, right? With the rise of the Christian right, we tend to think of, the culture wars, Christian nationalists and conservatives as, folks who are by definition, anti-cosmopolitan, people who are really just focused on, like building up walls around America and defending it from, forces all across the world. But what I found is that, actually the opposite is true. People who we tend to think of as kind of major new right figures, Jerry Falwell, folks, Phil Schlafly, actually spent a ton of their time cultivating allies overseas in a different way than liberals were. They were also kind of deeply cosmopolitan, right? Like they were paying attention to world events. They created international institutions. They spent a lot of time with, kind of fellow believers, politically and theologically across the world. And so they were also deeply shaped by, the Christian right was also deeply shaped by their global engagement.
Wow. So, all right. I'm trying to make sure I understand what's going on here. So it's like there was this movement, like this movement of Christians that as society moved from agrarian to more urban, and the problems changed, and it wasn't moving fast enough. Maybe the government, or even in the majority Christian, maybe wasn't moving fast enough, so it created this need that was felt within now what we consider mainline churches, where people now, where then they came out and they started to be champions of these various social issues. And so then they rise up, and then there seems to be a decline. What happened? How did that decline happen? Where was the disconnect there?
So going all the way back to 1908, what becomes the United Methodist Church, there at the time the Northern Methodists put out this kind of this social creed, and at that moment they, along with other 20 or 30 other denominations, organized the Federal Council of Churches, which becomes the National Council of Churches, and these mainline denominations and these ecumenical institutions they create are really pushing ideas that are going to become much more common politically decades later. They start calling for social security, right, for like young people, poor people and elderly people. They're talking about universal health insurance, unemployment relief, right? So in a lot of ways, these liberal Protestants early in the 20th century are articulating, right, through a kind of Christian lens, what later becomes the New Deal state, kind of, big government, right, interventionist government that is trying to take care of people from, cradle to grave, right? That's the aspiration. And from, the 1930s going into the 1960s, we have a lot of that, right? And, but beginning in the 1970s, politically, liberalism is kind of on the ropes. You get the rise of Ronald Reagan, and slowly but surely, right, a lot of these kind of social welfare programs get taken apart, and so folks like Ronald Reagan get into office in the he's elected in 1980, goes into office in 81, and he's arguing, right, like we need a smaller state, government should stay out of your business, let capitalism handle everything. And so there's a kind of religious analog to this as well, right, in the same way that the rise of religious liberalism helped create the rise of political liberalism. The rise of the Christian right in the 1970s helped, propel Ronald Reagan into office, and helped, make conservatism kind of a mainstay of American politics. But one of the things that had to happen before that was that the religious left had to kind of get into trouble. And there are a lot of really complicated sociological reasons why that happens. In a nutshell, the leaders of these mainline organizations and, the National Council of Churches and other ecumenical organizations, start moving to the left, over time. And so by the 1960s, they're in the front lines of the civil rights movement. Many of these ministers are marching with Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and Selma. They're leading the protests against the Vietnam War. They're advocating for anti-colonial movements and decolonization in Africa. And what they find is that, many of these ideas, right, are like really unpopular with everyday churchgoers. That, for all the moral seriousness they've shown, for all their commitment to these values, it really didn't trickle down to the pews in the ways that they had expected. So one of the things that was always true in American Protestantism became much more evident in the 1960s, which is that there's a gap in values between the clergy and the laity, right? Like, the clergy, which is going to, Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and reading, Marx in seminary or whatever, right? Like, like really like engaging the whole world of ideas, right? Are then, sent to a small town in Iowa. Their congregation doesn't, understand why, their minister is marching with MLK. And so what happens is that there's kind of clergy-laity gap in values that by the 60s widens into a chasm. And so a lot of the more conservative laity start rebelling against the clergy, start trying to kick them out. They start withholding funds from and donations from the church. So there's a lot of kind of financial trouble that these organizations get into because of the kind of rebellion of, people in the pews, as well as their conservative activist allies. The other thing that happens is that a lot of the, young people in the churches that do get reached by these values, who grew up in, American Baptist church or a Congregationalist church, and they have absorbed the values of the clergy who are saying, you have to be anti-racist if you want to be a good Christian. You have to, really take poverty seriously, if you want to be a good Christian. They're finding they absorb those values, they believe in them, they hold them to be true, but they're not finding them in their home churches, right? Like the conservative, all the conservatives around them, right, aren't expressing these things. And so many of these young folks, starting in the 1960s and accelerating into the 1970s, take their Christian values, right, the values they grew up with and were instilled in them through their Protestant churches, and they find other avenues to express those things, right? So, in the 1930s, if you wanted to, fight poverty or racism, most of your choices, especially if you're a woman, white middle-class woman, to do that was through church-based organizations. But by the 1960s, there's the Peace Corps, there's human rights organizations, there's, the NAACP, there are all kinds of, quote-unquote secular organizations that young folks find themselves drawn to because they see them as better expressions of Christian values than what they see in their, in the churches in which they grew up, right? Some of those people, go and some of those young people go and, do their activism or human rights work or charity work, and they maintain their membership in their church, but others, go and start working for these organizations and then never look back. They start disaffiliating. So starting in the 1970s, mainline Protestant churches start losing funds, and they start getting older. They start losing their young people, and they start shrinking in number, right? So by the time you get the rise of the Christian right in the 1970s, these kind of mainline, more liberally inclined denominations that have been the source of the religious left in this country, or at least one of the most important ones, is shrinking, right? Just as the Christian right is expanding.
That makes so much sense. I love the way that you're explaining it. It's so fascinating. And one thing that you said that hit me is when you said that, as has always been the case, there is a gap between the clergy and the laity. And I would agree with that. The clergy seem to have, because I am clergy, we seem to have these idealized versions of what people that aren't in our ministry or aren't professionals should be doing. And I've experienced that and I've lived that. So that's so fascinating. But it tied in my mind this idea of how interconnected politics and theology is. So here's what I mean. It seems like, I'm just going to point something else and I'll ask you to give your take on it. So it seems like a conservative today might be considered a liberal 100 years ago or 200 years ago, meaning that someone that had like a normal conservative, most of the people I talk to, if I were to say, should blacks and whites be able to intermarry, I don't know anyone that would say no. I don't personally know anyone that say no. Of course, I'm sure there are people that are. I would feel that way, that call themselves Christians, or maybe feel whatever. I'm not the one that judges that, but that is a change. That's a shift is what I'm saying. And it seems like these liberal, conservative, they're liquid, fluid terms. They change over time. So, but at the same time, it seems like our politics follow our theology, or vice versa. I don't know, but they're so linked. Like for instance, if you look at, like, I could probably guess if someone were to say that they lean left theologically, I could probably guess and probably be right many times, 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10 times, on what they feel about a certain topic, say abortion, same-sex marriage, social security, big government, whatever, big versus small, whatever it is. What have you found in your research? Has that been true? That you've seen that theology and politics basically go hand in hand, but they change over time? I'm just curious to find your insights on that.
Yeah, so I think for much of the 20th century and, into the present as well, there's been kind of like a two-party system, right, in American religion. In the same way as there's a kind of two-party system in American politics. And so what you find is that, if you talk to people, imaginary people in the 1940s about, what they believe, at a moment when the United States was divided between, kind of liberal ecumenical Protestants on the one hand and evangelical Protestants on the other, liberal ecumenical ones being all the both theologically and politically liberal, evangelicals being predominantly conservative, right, in the way that we would understand those terms today. So, if you talk to most folks, right, like they would, agree with like a mixture of, both of those things, in the same way as if you talk to some Democrats and Republicans, they would actually be kind of, like their actual views would be messy and complicated and kind of be all over the political spectrum, right? But, with the political system, you kind of have to, right, and come November, you kind of have to vote, right, one or the other. We don't have quite the same thing in our religious politics, but at the same time, there's certain moments, of conflict where people kind of have to choose sides, right? So even though kind of theological liberalism and theological conservatism doesn't really capture, right, like everybody in this country today or in the past, they're kind of two poles, right, that kind of pull people in one direction or another. And so that's kind of my starting point for thinking some of this stuff. But Josh, you're absolutely right that, every, theology, right, is, a reflection, right, a kind of engagement, for Christians, it's an engagement with the Bible from the standpoint of your own kind of social and cultural world, right? Like, when you open up those pages, right, you are bringing to those pages in part, right, like your own upbringing, your family history, your social environment, your views, your, all this kind of cultural baggage to that experience. And that's always been the case, right? Going all the way back to the writing of the Bible, right? Which, at least in part, kind of reflects, some of the kind of cultural attitudes of the era and the, historical context and what people knew and didn't know at the time. So this is kind of a perennial problem, and it's always, right, there's always been this kind of intermixture, right? There was never a moment when, religion and politics or church and state, were really separated in this country, right? People mix these two things together. I think one of the points I try to hammer home in my book is that, oftentimes communities, religious communities, people who think of themselves as primarily, revolving around theology, right? That they are also constituting themselves, organizing themselves, and creating an identity for themselves that are, political, right? That like they're the way in which they draw boundaries and, say like, here's who we are, and that's different from them over there, right? That's just as much, what we would call political as it is religious, right? Just as much ideological as.
I really appreciate your level of insight, because I think it's, I don't know, I think it's fascinating, being that you're not necessarily a member of faith, and you're kind of like outside looking in, which I think gives a much better and objective view, of like who Christians are. I mean, like, so I'm a believer. I'm a Christian, and I have lots of atheist friends, and they're loving, they're good people, and they tell me stuff that like, hey, do you know that like your ilk, are doing X, Y, and Z? And I'm like, yeah, they're all crazy, like, but I'm curious as an observer of religion and U.S. history, and I hope this isn't going to put you on the spot, but it probably will be. Like, what would you say are the top three contributions of, I don't know, Protestant religious people in the country, going as far back as you like, and then what would be sort of like the top three, I don't know what's the right word to use, like oopses, negative
things. Oops, oopsies.
Faux pas.
Faux pas.
Faith faux pas.
It's such a interesting question. The United States is such a culturally Christian country, and a culturally Protestant country in particular. And you kind of see this when you're not like when you're not yourself a Protestant, you kind of start seeing it everywhere. You're like, right, like, I guess in a sense, like I wrote this book because I was trying to figure out like the country that I emigrated to, and the country that, like, right, it's, it's sort of like the air the folks breathe around here. And so, the hard thing to do is to say, is this particular thing the way it is because it's Protestant or because it's American?
Yeah.
Right? Like, did Protestantism shape America, or did America shape Protestantism? Because the way in which the religion is practiced here is really different, right, from other countries. Just, like I'm right now, 10-minute drive from Canada, and the religious landscape and what evangelicalism looks like in that country is really different, even though there are a lot of kind of cultural and, political similarities between the two countries. And so even, like a few miles, right, can like make a really big difference. And so this is kind of the puzzle that people have been struggling with, right? How to disentangle America's Protestant heritage with, the heritage of American politics, geography, history of settler colonialism, slavery, warfare, right? Like all these things that make America what it is, suburbanization, all these lawns, like how do we like separate these things out? And for me, that's kind of an impossible thing to do. And so, the starting point, right, is these things are intertwined. They've always been intertwined, and there's no way to kind of pull them out to sort of identify, like, here are the specific things that Protestants have contributed to the history of this country. Having said that, people have talked about, the promotion of individualism, the creation of civil society, meaning kind of like, non-governmental affiliations and associations has been kind of a Protestant contribution. The importance of things like conscience, kind of a very Protestant idea. The missionary impulse, and the way in which helping sort of heathens across the world, which is the way that we put it in the 19th century, is kind of translated to today's humanitarian and human rights movements. So the list sort of goes on and on and on. On the negative side, there's a long history of anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, religious bigotry, as well as the ways in which, Protestantism, like many religions, has gotten entangled with slavery, racism, economic inequality, and so on and so forth, right? Which just kind of goes back to my original point, right? Is like, if you start looking for Protestantism in American history, you find it everywhere. There's the good stuff, there's the bad stuff, right? It's all around.
Yeah, I was thinking when you're talking, because I wanted you to drill in a little bit on racism and the culpability of the specifically American Protestant church or even evangelical church. You could talk about the separation there, liberal and Protestant, because I'd like to think that I would have been an abolitionist. I like to think that I would have been, marching with Martin Luther King, but I don't know. And maybe probably not. I have no idea, depending on how I was, where I grew up. But when we're digging in on this, I guess, because one thing I hear a lot, or it's basically a condemnation of Christianity because of its involvement with slavery. And my question, or what I'd like you to, speak into is, you have these two sides, right? The people who oppose and the people that supported slavery probably both said they were Christian in that time, or at least came out of that. Describe a little bit of the relationship that Christianity in America has had with racism and slavery.
So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and I say this not as a form of judgment, Josh, but the odds are, overwhelming odds, is that you nor I would have been abolitionists or civil rights activists. And the reason that's the case is because these were very small, narrow, radical movements at the time, right? People really thought of these folks as radicals who, after the fact, got accepted as obviously being right? Like, of course slavery should have ended. Of course segregation is a bad thing. We can tell ourselves today, but the folks who were participating in these movements were thought of, and I think rightly so from the perspective of the era, as radicals. And so these were small minority movements, oftentimes with very little support, which is part of the reason why, folks that were marching with Martin Luther King Jr., faced so much flack. And so, that's sort of, one observation that I have. People talk about the history of American evangelicalism and its relationship with slavery. It's complicated. Some folks argue that at first, as evangelicalism spread through the American South, these are the Methodists and Baptists primarily, that they at first were kind of, against slavery or uninterested in slavery, but over time kind of adapted to the cultural norms of the region and, then became supporters of slavery, theological racists, essentially. Other scholars dispute this, that, there was never an initial moment. Actually, there was a lot of support for slavery from the very beginning. And this is, of course, among the white community, right? The Christianity also spread among enslaved folks and freed black people in the antebellum South, and had very different sort of iterations, right? It looked different, it sounded differently, and the ideas that African Americans were theological ideas they were passing on themselves, right, were very different from what their white overseers wanted them to believe. By the mid 20th century, the relationship with the civil rights movement was also complex. The kind of liberal mainline Protestant churches were among the very first large white organizations to condemn segregation. So lots of folks in the 1930s and 1940s were saying, racism is a bad thing, racial prejudice is a bad thing, we shouldn't be prejudiced. But very few people were saying okay, and that means we should get rid of segregation in the South. It's a system that had to go. And so the Federal Council of Churches and some of these mainline Protestant denominations were some of the very first large national organizations to specifically condemn Jim Crow, say segregation's got to go, in the United States. Really just the American Communist Party got there first, which kind of gives you a sense of like how radical of an idea this was in 1946 when the Federal Council of Churches proclaimed it. At the time, most evangelicals supported segregation in the United States. By the 1960s, American liberal Protestants were, many of them were on the front lines of the anti-segregation movement, right? Joining the Southern Christian Leadership Council and lobbying for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And thinking, right, starting to think more broadly and expansively about segregation and the problem of racism. They started talking about reparations in the late 1960s. They started talking about colonialism in the late 1960s. They were thinking about, segregation not just as something that will kind of end and then we're done and, hooray, we're equal, right? But kind of a long-term process requiring restitution and economic equality and political liberation and autonomy and letting African Americans decide for themselves how, they want to, in what way they want to be a part of the United States. By which point, American evangelicals had come around to the earlier positions that these liberal Protestants had taken, which is that, essentially racism is a problem, but it's a problem of individual hearts and minds that can be solved through education, not government action. And so, this is one of the ways in which, right, evangelicals in opposition to kind of liberal ecumenical Protestants started positioning themselves as kind of centrists, right? We are the folks who believe in racial liberalism, it's up to the individual person to get rid of racist beliefs. We don't actually need to restructure society in any way. And look at all these radicals, right, among these mainline churches who are, demanding reparations. Aren't they terrible, right? So evangelicals in the 1960s, the evangelical movement was really good at using these politics, right, including racial politics, kind of wedge issues, right, to kind of insert themselves into American politics and to kind of gain a political and cultural advantage over their liberal opponents.
Man, I have so many questions, but I know we're coming to the place where we're gonna have to bring it to an end. But so, all right, I wanna phrase this. I want to phrase it correctly. Well, I guess one real quick one. Were there any were there conservatives? I mean, I know you said they kind of adopted the previous liberal stance, but were there anyone that you would consider a conservative Christian of the time that was on the leading edge of any of these social reforms?
So lots of folks were super complicated and
sure,
hard to kind of pin them left or right. One example is Reinhold Niebuhr, who is a hero today to both the religious left and the religious right. Kind of hard to pin him down. A former pacifist and Christian socialist who, by the 1950s, was kind of a leading Cold War hawk. There is John Foster Dulles, remembered as kind of the right-wing, kind of hawkish Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower, who in the 1930s and early 1940s was leading the Protestant charge to create a world government, which, eventually kind of became less than that, the United Nations, but he played a really big role, or liberal Protestants played a really big role in the creation of the UN, and, he kind of took a turn, and then there are figures like Walter Judd, a congressman from Minneapolis, one of the most important players in immigration reform in the United States, was one of the leading figures in getting rid of Chinese exclusion, Japanese exclusion laws from American immigration policy and opening up the American immigration system to people who were to refugees and, folks from Asia who have been historically barred from the United States. Well, at the same time, he was an absolute economic libertarian. And when his denomination, the Congregationalists, who were in the process of merging with another denomination to create today's United Church of Christ, during that moment, he led a kind of breakaway denomination who were opposed to both the economic politics and the ecclesiological politics of his religious community, and he kind of led 100,000 people and started a new denomination. And so folks like Judd, along with Reinhold Niebuhr and John Foster Dulles, right, it's hard to kind of pigeonhole them in this kind of spectrum of, left and right politics in the United States, right, because at certain moments, they went in different directions,
Sure.
combined ideas and movements that, wouldn't fly in our contemporary polarized moment, but from their own perspective made perfect sense to them.
Yeah. So that's very helpful. Thank you. So from outside, and this is kind of the last big question, and then a small one to end. Smallish. Small. Who knows? You know what I mean? Sometimes I think it's a small question, then it becomes like way bigger than I thought. So, but from an outside perspective looking in, because I like to think, people like Christianity is unique. Christianity is the way. I believe Jesus is the way personally. Like I believe relationship with them, right? So I believe those things very deeply for everybody. I think that's, me, you, Will, especially Will. I mean, everyone, that's what I believe. So I like to think, oh man, we're not like everybody else. We're unique. We're God's chosen people, blah, whatever. From this outside perspective, looking in, how has that shaped your view of Christianity? Because, or even your view of Jesus, maybe it has, maybe those are totally separate things. And I know they are historically, but how's that? Because more about Christianity, the Bible. I mean, probably definitely than me, more about the history of Christianity. I don't know about the Bible, and I've studied the Bible a lot, but more about that than almost all of the pastors in America, 99.9% of them, about the history of Christianity. And I've seen it, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. How has this study shaped your view? How did you view Christians before and Christianity before? How do you view it now? Much as you feel comfortable sharing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have mixed feelings. The kind of Will's framing was really helpful here, kind of the good and the bad, right? I've come to appreciate, on both sides of the political spectrum, the sincerity with which people, carry on their work. I've also, as I wrote a book about religious politics, I've also understood that, most pastors' lives are profoundly much more boring than, what I write about, right? It's, like trying to figure out how to fix a leak on the roof or, just going and spending time with somebody who's, in trouble, getting a coffee with, a person who just needs a little bit of counseling basically. And so, I've come to also appreciate in addition to, sort of the good and the bad, right? It's just, right, a lot of the kind of lives and work of, both believers and ministers is actually pretty mundane, right? And doesn't relate very deeply to, the kind of stuff that I write about. The question, Josh, that you raised about the missionary impulse in the sense that, everybody has to, it's kind of one of the fundamental
for sure.
theological tenets, right? Christianity, it's
Islam, a missionary religion.
Right, it's kind of missionary. Yeah, and sort of what that's meant, right, is really interesting. I think that's had a really profound function in American history. That the impulse to go out and convert the entire world, right, also leads you to go out into the world, and you're a missionary in 1910 and you're a Northern Presbyterian and, you're in a village in rural China somewhere and you're trying to explain, right, the ecclesiological differences between Presbyterians and Congregationalists and why these villagers really care, right, about this thing that you really care about, right, because, you were, right, like from this very specific community. And of course they don't, and they don't understand these differences. And so one of the things that, the missionary movement did was it, created a kind of imperative to, right, like break down these barriers between American denominations, right? That didn't so much happen in the United States, that like the Congregationalists and Presbyterians became friends, right? They first started cooperating overseas, right, because people they were dealing with didn't care about these denominational differences. It made no sense in the Chinese or Indian or Kenyan contexts. And so this sense that, actually maybe we should break down some of our boundaries was then brought back home into the United States. And so that kind of sense of ecumenism, right, really developed overseas through the kind of missionary encounter and, tied into, in very interesting ways, into debates about American religious pluralism. Well, maybe if like denominational differences don't matter, maybe like Catholics are okay too. Maybe if really like stretch things out, maybe we can like invite Jews into the public culture of the United States, right? And so there are ways in which, this thing that's like feels very uniquely Christian then kind of becomes part of a broader dialogue about American acceptance. The missionary movement was also like full of really interesting contradictions, in the 1920s at a time when most women were barred from any profession in the United States, essentially, except for teachers until they got married and homemakers, right? There were, in the 1920s, more American women working as doctors in India, overseas, than there were back home in the United States, right? Many of these women were what we would today, call like folks who never wanted to get married to men, what today we would call lesbians. And so the missionary movement and this kind of impulse to, go out and convert the world seems pretty straightforward on the face of it. But in practice, when you go out and start talking to the world and encounter the world's diversity and set up institutions and have these discussions and debates, right? Oftentimes you find yourself kind of transformed, right? And so even, things that seem like really fundamental tenets of Christianity, right? Like, other folks should become Christians. Actually, in practice, historically, really, really complicated, really nuanced, have all kinds of effects on both Christian and American history that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so I guess all that is to say, one of the things I've come away with in studying the history of Christianity is just how malleable it is, just how much it's able to transform and absorb and change over time, right? The Christianity we had 100 years ago is not what we have today, and historians are not in the business of predicting, but I'm pretty certain that in 100 years, Christianity in the United States and in the broader world is going to look really different from what it looks like today. I think I can say that with some confidence.
As long as Jesus tarries, one of those old phrases. Sorry, I just had to throw that in. It made me think of it. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gene. What are you working on now? We mentioned your books. How can people follow you, get involved in your research? How can they check out what you're doing?
Yeah, so when I'm not teaching classes at the University of Buffalo, I'm occasionally writing for public journals. You can find my public writings at GeneZubovich.com, GemeZubovich. I wrote a book called Before the Religious Right, available at local bookstores, Amazon, wherever you get your books. Google me, find my email, send me feedback. I'd love to connect and chat with all of you.
Thanks so much,
Will,
Gene.
Josh, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah,
it is mutual.
Well,
the feeling is mutual.
I guess that's it. So, we'll see everybody next week. All right, take care.